0 to 60 can define a performance car, but it's the fastest 60 to 0 that's the aim of Tarok's brakes. From road cars to race cars, circuits, special stages, or the autostrada, nothing reduces speed like Tarok's brakes. Italy gave the world the art of Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Tarok's has given drivers the art of stopping. For more information and to acquire your own masterpiece, visit taroks.co.uk.
I'd like to introduce to the Backseat Driver Radio Show Neil Fretwell from the Vintage Hot Rod Association. Now, anybody who watches or keeps an eye on social media cannot have failed to have seen that hot rodding is an increasingly popular sport. I dare say it's been a sport for a long while. But that's why I've decided to invite Neil Fretwell on the show. Neil, welcome to the Backseat Driver Radio Show.
Hi, Mike. It's nice to be here with you.
Now, before we go into its increasing popularity, I mean, hot rods have been around for years because, I mean, anybody who watches films, TV or anything like that cannot have failed to have seen that hot rods are popular. And I conclude in many ways it all started in America.
That's right, yeah. It all really kicked off in Southern California, and it was before they called them hot rods. Back in the early 30s, probably the late 20s, there were guys hopping up Model Ts, Model A's, things like that, and going out to the dry lakes at Muroc, which is now Edwards Air Force Base, and doing some time trials. And then in 1936, they set up the Southern California Timing Association, which is still going to this day, and they're famous for racing at Bonneville, running sort of 600 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And they were doing that up until the war, and they were the Model A engine was the king before the war. The V8 was relatively new, but it was with the outbreak of war and soldiers going from all over America, and especially from California, meeting up and spreading the word of hot rodding to people. And shortly after the war, when they came back, they'd earned a lot of money whilst they was away from home. Some based in England. They went back home with money in their pockets, and then they started, making these cars go faster and faster. And in 1948, a guy called Robert Peterson set up Hot Rod magazine, which is pretty much when the word hot rod became the generic term.
Yeah.
And they didn't look back from there. Hot rods. I think it's still the biggest selling car magazine in the world. So it all started from a guy going out to the dry lakes with some stuff he printed himself effectively. It just went from there. But the term hot rod was considered derogatory for quite some time. You would see in papers, hot rod races, hot rod crash.
Yeah.
Newspapers were sensationalising that word. They just used to call them roadsters or coupes, to the body styles.
Yeah.
And often they'd be referred to as gal jobs or as hop-ups. Hot irons was another name. So, the hot rod was a derogatory term, but now we celebrate it.
So basically the idea comes from just making a car go faster.
Yeah, that's the general spirit of things. Is you get an old car, something you can afford. You hear stories back in the day of people buying a Model T for $5.
Yeah.
Going to a scrapyard, picking the engine of choice, putting that in there, and a lot of these guys were doing this stuff at home, often with very limited tools, and it was from the 20s, 30s onwards. Some people were producing speed equipment, and they'd save up, put a different set of cylinder heads on if they had a V8. Put a cam in there, and take it racing. These were dual-purpose cars and young guys, as I say, before the war, without a lot of money, and all they wanted to do was make their old cars go fast.
Yeah. So from starting with a basic car that went faster, I mean, they've developed into they took on a very distinct look, didn't they? Because if memory serves, the hot rod tends to be, shall we say, chopped down or an open top car. Bigger wheels at the back than at the front, and a V8 up front, and a lot of the ways an exposed engine in certain instances.
Well, that's become sort of the standard, shall we say. The as I said earlier, the four-cylinder from the Model A was the king to start with, because they used that engine ran for around 4 years.
Yeah.
And there were companies making overhead valve conversions for them, different carburetors, there were cam grinders out there. So they were the king to start with. But the V8 was gaining popularity just before the war, but post-war, that's when it really exploded, and the flathead V8 really took over. And as you say, that the look was, well, the FCTA, they only run roadsters at their events, you see. They didn't run coupes, sedans, or anything like that.
Yeah.
So the roadster was the car of choice. Fenders off, so the wheels are open. Obviously, saves weight, makes it more streamlined. And the big and little tyres is the little tyres at the front, again, cheating the wind. The big tyres at the back helped with gearing because axles only came in a couple of different ratios. If you put taller tyres on, the chances are you get more speed.
Right.
The idea of these guys, they weren't racing one against one. It was always on their own, and they were going for flat-out speeds over quite some distance. So it didn't matter if it took a little longer to get there. But the idea was, if you've got enough torque in the engine, it'll be able to turn the wheels at the same speed, and you'll go faster because you change your ratios effectively.
Right. So that actually now explains that, because I often wondered where this idea came from of the little wheels and the big wheels and everything else. And I conclude with all this, they looked into the transmissions and the axles and everything else to make them go faster as well.
Well, that's right. Not so much the transmissions, although there were a couple of favourable swaps. You could buy, if you had a V8 gearbox in your car from behind a flathead, the gearbox of choice was 1939 because the ratios were better distance, do you see, for a lightweight car.
Yeah.
There were some people swapping in things like the Sail gearboxes, again for the different ratios. But in the rear end, the thing there was there was people making them before this, but I think it was around 1947-48. A company called Hallebrand, who are known for their wheels as much as anything else, developed what's called a quick change rear axle, where instead of driving into the centre of the pinion, into the centre of the crown wheel, it drives underneath. You get a change set of gears on the back, and then it drives back in, and you can change your ratios to pretty much anything you want. I had one in my Model A, and it has a 378 ring and pinion in the axle itself. But with the quick change, I can, within 2 to 3 minutes, I can change from 411 gears to 350 gears.
Yeah.
And, 411s are good for sprinting, 350s are good for a longer track. So, that became a popular way of doing things.
Right. Just out of interest, how many gears did the cars have? With the because it's one of those things, you see things and you think, well, given the fact that they do race them against the clock over a specific distance, how many gear changes do you guys actually perform, or else do they use the automatic gear transmissions?
Well, people are installing automatics, although, they do absorb a lot of power, especially, really, with a lot of the earlier engines, they're not so much about the horsepower, it's about the torque they put out.
Yeah.
But a standard transmission for Model A was a 3-speed, and the same for the V8s. Better selection of gears. There's a huge gap on the Model A's between second and top, but there are better ratios in the V8 boxes.
Yeah.
But a lot of people these days are transferring in 5 speeds and things like that, to get better range. So it's better for driving on the motorways. Roads have become a lot faster than they used to be. So if you're travelling any distance, it's nice to have a 5th gear.
Yeah. So I conclude, like a lot of those cars back then, as you said, and possibly today, a lot of these cars are still road legal cars. You can drive them about on the road as a normal vehicle.
Oh, yeah, definitely. The cars are all road legal. I know it often raises the question about the open wheels, but it is something that we get away with, shall we say.
Yeah.
I've been told by a couple of road traffic officers that it's a bit of a grey area when it comes to the open wheels.
Yeah.
It's probably not expecting much on that one, really, but it's something we get away. We're getting older, the cars are getting older, and the police are getting younger, it seems. So I think our cars are a little way off their radar, but no, our guys, it's something we really encourage in the Vintage Hot Rod Association, that people use their cars. Most of the people that go and compete at our events drive their cars, trailers. They're not totally dismissed, but you'll certainly get ripped if you show up on a car and you haven't.
Now, which are the most popular cars? So you watch a lot of these programs, and it's the Ford Model A's and things like that. And as you said earlier on, a Model T. Which are the... In America, of course, there would have been certain cars that were popular, and as you run out of them, other cars, makes and models will have taken over. I mean, besides the early ones, which are the ones to have and which are the most desirable?
Well, the one that's considered the archetypical hot rod is the 32 Ford Roadster. It was the first year for the V8, which was a game changer for Ford. But it's the one, you haven't got to swap the engine out. You've only got to tune the engine to get the power out of it. Whereas with the earlier cars, you'd have to fit a V8. So the 32 Ford is the one that really commands, the most attention, shall we say. Yeah. It's the archetypical car. But however, because of that, it's more expensive. So we find in the Vintage Hot Rod Association that most people favour the Model A. Yeah. It's the thing is, it's as well, it's a lighter car anyway. So if you perform the same amount of modifications on a flathead engine, your Model 8 should go quicker. And the same goes if you go backwards further with a Model T. That's lighter than the Model A again. Yeah. But it's definitely the Model A is definitely one of the most favoured cars, and because of our climate, it's not Southern California. Closed cars are very popular as well. It's not all roadsters. There's a lot of coupes. There's some sedans. Look at all sorts of body styles, Yeah. But that's the way I see it. The 32 is kind of considered the archetypical, but I would say the Model A is the more popular over here.
Yeah. Now, if you look at the, shall we say, the movement in England, of course, there was with a lack of access to things like Model A's. I conclude that's where the Ford Prefect suddenly became popular because of, shall we say, its similarity to its American equivalents.
Well, that's right. I mean, we don't cater to the British stuff. We do try to hang on to, make everything American style. That's the thing we're aiming for. But you're exactly right there, because we've got a guy in the club whose name is Ken Cooper. He was playing around with old V8 Fords back in the 50s and 60s, but they were few and far between. So the Prefects, Populars, things like that was, they were cheap, easy, accessible cars. And very similar in setup to their bigger cousins from over the water. So yeah, they became very popular, and much like the speed equipment in America, there was companies over here making stuff. You could buy. It was a company called Elva made an overhead conversion for a little Ford Pop engine, and there's plenty of people making Seifeld parts. Yeah. So yeah, they're exactly the same thing. A couple of carburetors, some high compression. A bit of a high lift cam, and you've transformed them. I mean, they're only rated at 8 and 10 horsepower, weren't they? The old Populars. Yeah. So it wouldn't take much to up them from there.
Now, with you saying like the Vintage Hot Rod Association likes to stick to American, I mean, how do people go on getting them? Because I conclude over in America, the vintage ones will have now become quite rare, and the Americans won't be overly fond of parting with them.
Exactly right, Mark. The cars that had history, and documented history, and there's been some good historians out there doing this stuff. Particularly a guy called Don Montgomery. It must have been about 30 years ago now. He put out a call to start going through people's shoeboxes of photographs to see what he could find about things. And the cars became famous because of the books he wrote, really. Although some of them were famous, you've probably heard of his Kendarian cams. Yeah. And he's still got his cover he built in 39, funny enough. But yeah, I mean, initially, when I got into this about 30 years ago, there was a company making fiberglass bodies, and that's the first thing I looked at, was getting a fiberglass body, because I just didn't think the original still would be available. But it is out there. It's getting harder to find, and it's certainly getting harder to find the good stuff. As with any, make and model, really, as they get older and older, what was considered junk at 20 years ago is now considered a good find, isn't it? So, but no, there's stuff out there, and there are people replicating things in both fiberglass and steel. You can actually go out. There's a company called Brookville. There's another one called Rodbods, I think. And you can go out and actually buy a brand new 1932 Ford Roadster body.
Right. Because, I mean, one of the programs I enjoy watching from time to time is the American Pickers. And I suppose it's like classic cars. They'll be rooting and rummaging through something, through an old barn or a shed. And so all of a sudden they come across a shell of one of these cars, like a Ford Model A, and they get extremely excited about finding it. And then the problem is getting the guy to part with it.
Well, this is the thing. The difference, I think, with Americans and English people is they have a lot more land than us. So we find ourselves, if you've got a car, you have to sell it because you can't put the car on the trike because you've only got space for one car.
Yeah.
Or, obviously there are people with more room, but, your average Joe, they haven't got a lot of room around the house. And so, that, you get a car, you sell a car, you get a car. But in America, you tend to find that they can hang on to stuff. And especially if this stuff had little or no value at some point, like any old cars, really.
Yes.
Unless it's exotica, they go through a stage of being worth almost nothing. Yeah. So they wouldn't part with them. They'd park them up in the corner, and that's where they stay until, somebody comes knocking on head core asking what they're doing with it. So, yeah, I mean, it's like the American Pickers obviously staged for TV to an extent, but the guy, is it Mike? It's the big league guy. I mean, he's a very, very keen hot rodder. Yeah. I think he's got himself a couple of cars. So yeah, he's like the rest of us. We're excited anything that you put petrol in, aren't we? So and if it's that mark you prefer, then all the better. But yeah, I mean, there's old Fords all over the place in America. It's just finding them.
I mean, ironically enough, you said that. I was reading an article the other day about classic cars and barn finds in France. And they said the exact same thing because like America, okay, it's not as big as, but France is actually a huge country, and they said the same thing. The French needed somebody in France needed a new car. They didn't trade the old one in; they parked it in a barn or wherever because they'd such an enormous amount of space to put it in a barn. Didn't take up any room, and they just wandered off and bought a fresh one. So, yeah, that it really does explain why suddenly these old cars suddenly come back to light again.
Yeah, we visited a friend out in California, out on the West Coast, and he was walking us around his plot. I think he had about 7 acres. A lot of it was brushland, it's a very, very hot part of the state, but he was showing the front of his place, and it was funny. He said, "This is the car my dad took to high school. This is the car I took to high school." And, it was amazing that he had all these things there. I think he must have had about 12, 13 cars.
Yeah.
And, they were, a couple of them were restored very, very nicely. Very talented guy with what he could do. But some of the others, like his high school car was a Studebaker. And I think he went to high school, let's say late 60s, early 70s, something like that. And this Studebaker, it'd probably been part of his parents when he finished school. And it moved up to his place whenever he moved up there, 10 years later maybe. Yeah. And there it sat, and it had he was into modifying stuff, and probably the first car he tried to modify. And it was just a simple 2-door Studebaker, but it had a crazy flame job on it, Yeah. So that was his kickback back then. But they just didn't have to get rid of cars. And and one day, not say one day, over time, it turns around and they all become worth something again, don't they?
Yeah, and I suppose the thing is, with like certain parts of France, over in America, especially California, because the weather is nice, they won't deteriorate quite the same, will they? I mean, they don't suddenly return to Mother Earth like certain cars in England do due to our, at times, rather damp atmosphere.
That's right. We've got a 53 Chevy here that we brought home from California. We've had it over about 12 years now. And when I was first stripping it down to do some work on it, the nuts and bolts come out cleanly. You don't take the grill off and then it's all rusty behind. I've had Mark 1 and Mark 2 consoles where they're falling apart in your hands as you start unbolting stuff. Yeah. But this thing, all the edges are still... don't get me wrong, it's got its issues. But all, most of the edges are very crisp and clean. And, it's nice to work with. I was, again, out in the States. Excuse me a second. I went to a scrapyard in Arizona, and there was it's a Mark 1 console, and it didn't have a single rust bubble on it anywhere. Sitting in the scrapyard, and it's probably been there for a long time too.
And I conclude, if you find one of these, to acquire
Sorry, Mark, can we just pause a second? I've just, if you can pause record and we'll come back to it. Just got a tickle. Sorry about that. I've got this terrible tickle on my throat, and it's not COVID, but...
Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So,
sorry about that.
Don't worry about it. If you actually acquire one of these old, shall we say, a Model A shell, or something like that, how difficult is it to get everything to go with it, to turn it into a hot rod?
Well, there's a huge following of Model A Fords. The 57 Chevy is the most restored car in America, apparently, and the most restored vintage car is the Model A.
Yeah.
And because of that, there's a huge aftermarket resource for parts. So you can get, for restoration purposes, you can get most everything you'd need. And then when it comes to hobbying them up, there's guys out there doing much the same and reproducing a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
But, and there's always the original stuff as well, so it's a challenge at times, but it's not an impossible challenge, there's lots of stuff out there.
Yeah. Now, the one thing, as I said, I notice over here, funnily enough, and going back to France, there is the Normandy Beach Races, which is dedicated to vintage hot rods and motorbikes, because I conclude the hot rodding scene does include some of the motorbikes. And in England, there's the ones at Pendine or Pendine Sands, depending how you want to pronounce it. There's one near York. I mean, the scene seems to be expanding considerably in England and Europe.
I think what's happened is there's been, I've been monkeying around with these things for 30 years, but there's definitely been an upsurge in things because of programs like American Pickers. Then you've got all these other ones. You had the Boyd Coddington Show, and there's Gas Monkey Garage and all these sort of things.
Yeah.
And because they're broadcast, around the world, people are picking up on this, and they're seeing what they are. So I think that's raised some awareness. But from what we've been doing with the VHRA, we never expected any of it. When we went down to Pendine, we got so much press coverage for it. And I think people realise, that because hot rodding, street rodding, whatever you want to call it, it was always a kind of frowned upon thing, quite often, that you'd be upsetting restorers and stuff. But I think with what's been on the telly and people seeing what we're doing with the cars down at Pendine, it's made people realise that, it is a serious hobby. We are serious about what we do, and we've got a foot firmly in the past when it comes to why we want to drive these cars. Hot rodding is certainly in America, not so much over here, but it's certainly a very, very important part of the story of the car in the 20th century.
Yeah. And I suppose the thing is, it's a little bit like restoring a car in England, a vintage car or something along those lines. If the car can be salvaged as it is, then don't start chopping it about. But if the car or the shell is beyond restoration to what it was, turning it into a hot rod is a very legitimate way of saving the vehicle.
Well, the body on my Model A, I didn't buy a whole car. I started collecting parts for it many, many years ago. But the body of my car, allegedly, had sat in a California scrapyard for more than 30 years.
Yeah.
And then, a guy was out there importing stuff. He asked me if I'd be interested in this particular one. I said, I'll give it a go, and it worked. But, quite often it's the stuff that other people don't want on their cars. It's the rough stuff. That's not to say some people don't cut up some good stuff, but for the most part, it's taking things that other people didn't want and building what we want out of them.
Yeah.
But given that they made 5 million Model A's, I don't think they'd be smart.
What you were saying earlier on about certain things, what is the format of hot rod racing, or whether it's against each other two at a time or against the clock? What is the format?
Originally, the first form of hot rod racing, as I said, but they were going out to the dry lakes in California, and they were originally they ran 6 abreast, and then they sort of whittled it down to the ones who were going to get timed properly.
Yeah.
So really, it was that was deemed very dangerous because it's very dusty. You can't see anything. So the guy out in front's okay. The 5 behind it could be going anywhere. So eventually, they settled on just one at a time. And that was the first form of hot rod racing. I've seen programs going back to paper programs going back to about 1932 for that sort of stuff. And then at the other side of the war, as they became more and more popular, that's when they started really getting a bad name. And there was street racing going on and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it was a guy called Wally Parks started the National Hot Rod Association, and I believe it was about 80 years ago this year, and they opened Santa Ana airfield up to the hot rod racers, and that's where drag racing started.
Right.
They chose a quarter mile because that's about the average length of a block in America, and that's where the kids were racing from stoplight to stoplight across each block, you see. So that's where they came up with that one. So yeah, that was the two forms of hot rod racing. There was also circle racing as well, with the midget type racers and the other types, the sprint type cars.
Yeah.
But for the most part, your bread and butter hot rodder, it would have been out of the lakes or at the drag strip.
Right. Now, like I said, I mentioned like the Normandy beach races. And, I mean, I conclude racing hot rods isn't exclusive to beaches, although it's suddenly proven popular. I conclude if you find a beach that's got good hard sand on it, away you go, because you're not likely to hit anything on a beach, really, are you?
Well, we at Pendine, that came to us as a bit of a gift, to be honest. The whole beach racing thing is a fairly new phenomenon when it comes to hot rods. It wasn't something that was done back in the day.
Right.
But for us, I mean, we were aware of Pendine and what the history of it was with Malcolm Campbell and Harry Thomas, but it wasn't something we ever really looked at because, I think someone had been quite a few years earlier, and they were just told there's no way you'll be getting your cars on the beach. And what it was is that there'd been an accident down there of some sort. I don't know the details. And the county council said, that's it, no more parking on the beach or anything like that.
Yeah.
And when it went back into the community council's hands, they wanted to find ways to create revenue, because the car parking for Pendine, the only revenue they get is from car parking. That's all they've got. There's no other income for them.
Yeah.
So it was a conversation in the pub at the then chairman of the council and a couple of friends saying, well, what shall we put on? And they thought, well, motorbikes and cars, obviously, because of the history of the place, but what type? So one of the fellas said, how about hot rods?
Yeah.
So the councillor went home, a guy by the name of Simon Morris, went home, probably a couple of pints in, and looked up hot rods in the UK. And he went through a couple of different places, looking at different websites. But when he got to our website, we run a page, and it shows not all the members' cars, those members that have sent us in some photographs. I think we've got about 40 or 50 on there. And he's looked at them. They're mostly open-wheeled, mostly from the 20s and 30s. To the layman, they look like Babs and the Bluebird, don't they? They're conjuring up that image. And that's kind of what the hell hot rodders were emulating anyway. They wanted to look like old sports cars.
Yeah.
So he got in touch with us, and the email said, would you like to put something on the beach? And my immediate response was, do you want to spot on a show?
Yeah.
Which I would have been interested in, because, to go on such an important, place, it's an absolute honour to do that.
Well, I mean, it's Pendine Sands are an historic location. It's like you said, with Perry Thomas and Babs and everything else for the land speed records.
Yeah. So, like I say, he said to us, so I said, is it a static thing you want us to do, or is there a chance we can race on your beach? And he came back and said, you can do what you like.
Right.
So I immediately jumped on that one and said, right, I need to... I said, it will definitely do something, but I'm going to have to do my homework and find out what this involves. Because at this point, I'd never organised an event in my life. I had I've been to plenty of events and, assisted at a few bits and pieces here and there, but certainly never organised anything. So there was a huge learning curve coming home to find out what you can and can't do from, a legal standpoint, and just going through everything. And it was as I was beginning to organise that a magazine by the name of Rodder's Journal dropped through my letterbox, and they had pictures of what they were doing at the Race of Gentlemen over in America, and it was like, oh no, we've been gazumped. But the difference is we run one car at a time on a very much longer course. So all the other beach races you see, up at Briglington, at Romo over in Denmark, in France, and in America. And I believe they're doing it in Japan and possibly even Australia now.
Right.
They're all doing it in a drag race fashion over an 8th mile.
Yeah.
We at Pendine, we run a half-mile long course where the cars can get flat out.
Right.
And we time the cars flat out. So, it's the same but very different. We're racing on a beach but in very, very different circumstances. I believe that our event on Pendine is unique for that.
Right.
We are the fastest beach racing in the world, which I know there's not many beach races, but it's a nice little title to have.
Yeah. Now, the one thing you do notice looking at all the photographs, because, you have a very, very active Instagram page, besides the cars themselves and the racing of them, there's a whole lifestyle goes with them. When you look at it, you think, well, it's a bit like people who own Harley-Davidson's motorbikes, people who own Indian motorbikes. There seems to be a definite lifestyle goes with this.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's one of those all-consuming things. For me, I got into the old cars and then immediately found the rock and roll scene.
Yeah.
Venues like Hemsby and that were doing weekenders, they still are. And, you went along there, and that's really where I got sort of exposed to the whole lifestyle of things.
Yeah.
American cars, there's a few hot rods, like you say, Indians, Harleys, British bikes, modified in like cafe races, something like that's more an English thing.
Yeah.
But, it's sort of, it's not for everybody, and it's certainly not something I tried to push at the VHRA.
Yeah.
I won't insist that everybody has to come into the pits in period clothing, but, it's something that a lot of the guys and girls just do. It's part of, what we're into. It's, like I say, it's a whole lifestyle thing, an all-consuming thing.
So
God only knows where it comes from. There's a screw loose somewhere, but we're stuck somewhere in the past. But I'd rather be at this end of it all, looking back, because you get to cherry pick all the good bits.
Yeah.
And none of the misery of war and famine and Lord knows what else people went through back in the day. Must have been a tough time growing up back then.
Well, I've always said that. That's the one thing about all forms of classic cars. I've always said it reminds people of the good old days. As to how good the good old days actually were still remains to be seen. Because I've often said at times they were probably as stressful and as demanding and as hard as they are today. But people tend to forget the negative and always remember the positives about it all.
Well, that's not a bad thing, is it? I guess it's best to remember the good and forget the bad. But I like to say it's very much a lifestyle thing, and like I say, we get to cherry pick the bits we like. So it's a good way of coming at things.
Now, just out of interest, the Vintage Hot Rod Association.
Yeah.
Strange question. Do you have to actually have one to be a member, or can you be a member just because you happen to be seriously into them, but you just don't have the capacity to own one?
No, we are strictly an owners club. We do get people questioning us on that one quite a bit, actually. The original thing when it originally started back in it was 1991.
Yeah.
When we was all a lot younger. A group called the Flyers. Wanted to get a bit more recognition for our style of cars. The more antique style hot rods rather than the modern street rods.
Yeah.
So they tried to get a collective together, called it the Vintage Hot Rod Association. But it was being younger that backfired on them, so they only really lasted a year or so. And it took. We often talked about resurrecting it. Different people said we should resurrect it. There's a lot of cars we need to make a presence, and it was around about. It'd have been 2000. Probably late 1999.
Yeah.
2009, 2010. I decided to sort of have a pop and see what we could do. I wanted to get onto the DVLA register so we can help with registrations for our old cars. And thinking about events and things like that. And within a couple of months of setting it up, printing some T-shirts and, saying to people, this is a resurrection of Vintage Hot Rod Association, we had over 100 people sign up. So, I knew I was doing something right. And just went up from there.
So,
with the cars, sorry to interrupt, but with the being owners only, the idea was to make it slightly tribal.
Yeah.
And that, if you saw someone in a VHRA T-shirt, that you knew they was a kindred spirit.
Right. And roughly how many members has the VHRA got now?
We're currently running at about 470 members.
Right.
So, which is, I often find it hard to believe, and I'm the man at the end of the pen, writing out the membership cards.
Yeah.
And it just amazes me that there's that many people running traditional style hot rods, and quite often, as is the case with most old car people, there's more than one car in the garage as well, isn't there? It's amazing to think, there could be close on. We've got members in Europe and America as well.
Yeah.
But it's mostly in the UK. It's amazing to think there's probably a potential of 1,000 hot rods, customs, whatever you want to call them, in garages or on driveways in this country. It's incredible, really.
Now, besides Pendine Sands, how many events do you guys have a year?
We put on 3 events a year. We have Pendon, which is obviously our jewel in the crown. We host another one which is for members only. It's a nice little private event at Prescott Hill.
Oh yeah.
Which is called GAL. We had that last weekend actually, and it went very, very well.
I must ask you, what does GAU stand for?
GAL, it simply means go. It's a word that comes from the roots of the word go back to opium dealers in the late 1800s, apparently.
Oh.
But it meant if you was high on opium. But for hot rod purposes, they used the word gal as a bastardisation of the word go.
Oh, right.
So it's basically a gal job was a go job.
Right.
But I've always liked the word gal, and I said if I ever produce anything or put an event or anything like that, I'd like to use it as that. So that's simply where that comes from. It's just a slang word for go.
Right. And where's your third one?
Our third one, we host a swap meet at the 1940s camp, which is rather apt for us people into the traditional end of things. It's a 1940s army camp in Cambridgeshire.
Right.
It's gone from my head for a second. Where it is? It's Ramsey. Ramsey, that's the one.
Yeah.
Ramsey in Cambridgeshire. Basically, it's just a bring and buy sale for old Ford parts, old American car parts, anything that sort of suits the ear of the VHRA. There'll be people trading all sorts of things, homewares, garage stuff, and all kinds of everything. So, we've got that one as well.
Now, it's only whilst to get in touch with you guys, I will guess that it's your Instagram page, VHRA. But I come to you mentioned it. What's your website?
Our website's just www.vhra.co.uk.
Yeah.
And there's everything you need to know about the association on there, rules for joining, pictures of members' cars. There's a news page. We don't run a newsletter. I put everything up on the website for all to see. And so we've got quite a strong online presence. And as you say, we're on Instagram and Facebook as well. I try to put something up most days for Instagram. Because we're really lucky. We've got a great bunch of photographers that follow us around, and they're really generous sharing their work with us. So, we've got an Instagram page that's we've got around 20,000 followers at the moment, but it's all down to those guys taking those incredible photographs.
Right. I must say, Neil, you've explained certain things, like why they have big wheels at the back and not at the front, and why things are a quarter of a mile, and that's been fascinating. All of a sudden, you suddenly realise why certain things are, but that's been absolutely fantastic. Neil,
I'm glad it's been informative to you, Mark. Sometimes, the answers are much simpler than you anticipate.
Well, yeah, because you look into things and you often think, I wonder why they do everything a quarter of a mile. Now, I know it's the distance of a block in the States.
Yeah.
But Neil Fretwell, thank you very, very much for joining me on the Backseat Driver Radio Show. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
And with you, Mark. It's been great fun talking about stuff.
Thanks very much indeed.
Rarely beaten on price, never beaten on service. Whether it's cars, bikes or commercials, Hoddy Tyres are the best in the business, and when it comes to tyre expertise and advice to supplying the correct tyres for your vehicle's specific requirements, nobody comes close to David Lakin and the Hoddy Tyres team. So give them a call on 01200 613 192 or visit the website at hoddytyres.co.uk.